You have to have an aim. The nobler the aim, the better your life. You've heard ever since you were tiny that you should act like a good person and you shouldn't lie, for example. And you might think, why not twist the fabric of reality so that it serves your specific short-term needs? Why act morally? If you can get away with something and it brings you closer to something you want, why not do it? It seems to me tied in with what I just mentioned. It's you destabilize yourself and things become chaotic. That's not good. And if you don't have a noble aim, then you have nothing but shallow, trivial pleasures, and they don't sustain you. Because life is so difficult, it's so much suffering, it's so complex. It ends, and everyone dies, and it's painful. Without a noble aim, how can you withstand any of that? You can't. So however you act now, better not compromise how you're going to be in a year, because that'll just be counterproductive. That's part of the problem with short-term pleasures, right? You have to act in a way that works now and tomorrow and next week and next month and so forth. And so you have to take your future self into account. Taking your future self into account isn't much different than taking other people into account. Well, morality for me is about action. And I'm an existentialist in some sense. And what that means is that I believe that what people believe to be true is what they act out, not what they say. Your life isn't the way you want it to be. How would it look if it was the way you wanted it to be? Or at least partly that way. And we aim at that. We look for impediments, psychological impediments, fears, avoidance strategies, that sort of thing. And we develop strategies. And we try to move towards that, I would say, ideal. The ultimate ideal is also the ultimate judge, because the ultimate ideal is something against which you fall far short. And that might be so painful that you can barely stand it. But then what you do is you lower the ideal and you raise your estimation of your potential. And what do I mean by lower the ideal? If you're comparing yourself to someone or even to a future self, and the gap is so painful that it paralyzes you, then you've created a dragon that you don't have the tools to master. And so what you have to do is you have to scale the dragon down to size until it's a size that you are willing to move toward. To those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. Now, it's brutal because it implies that reality works like this. When you're moving up, you go like this. And that's pretty nice. That's a lot better than this. But when you're going down, you go like that, right? It's like downhill, downhill, cliff. So you want to avoid the downhill path. If the uphill path is like this, which is exponential, let's say, or geometric, then what that means is that it doesn't matter how big the first steps you take uphill are. If you're disciplined in that, you'll speed up extraordinarily rapidly. Once you get the ball rolling, it doesn't roll in a linear fashion, it rolls in a geometric fashion. And lots of times people won't do things like go to the gym because they're so embarrassed about how they look or what sort of shape they're in. And it's a pain to start at the bottom, but you start at the bottom where you're weak. And if you want to rectify what's weak, you have to accept the fact that you're at the bottom and that the first steps are going to be painful. You have to admit your insufficiency to your own shame. What happens is that you actually don't notice something unless it interferes with what you're doing. Because what are you going to do? Notice everything? You can't do that. You can hardly notice anything. So what you do is you pick something to focus on. It's usually something that you value, because why else would you focus on it? So that means that your value system determines the direction of your perception. Bloody well think about that for a minute. If you're being enticed down a pathological road, you can accept or reject the invitation. Now, some people are better at enticing and some people enforce it more harshly, and there's all sorts of individual variability in situations like this, but just because you're offered the bait doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take it. So then you might ask yourself, well, what's the best antidote to the discomfort of life? And you might say, well, it's comfort. But a better antidote is something like adventure to excellence. That's far better antidote to suffering than the mere absence of suffering. Not to say that the mere absence of suffering, that's not nothing. So imagine your plans didn't work out. You sit down and you say to yourself, even if the world was conspiring against me and my failure was 95% the fault of external occurrences and other people, what did I do that wasn't as good as it could have been, and where did I fail to look so that the probability of my failure was higher? Now, to ask that question, you have to want the answer. And it's a very painful thing to do, because especially if you had given it your all to the degree you were able, and you have reason to be bitter, you're going to be searching for the errors that you still made. And discovering your own errors is always extremely painful, especially if they're errors that you're in love with. This is why it's so useful to listen to people. You might find out where you're stupid, and then you could stop being stupid. One of the reasons you confess your sins, let's say, is because you want to discover where you're insufficient. Now, it's painful.
painful. It's painful to encounter an impediment in the form of someone else's opinion that might show you where you're blind and ignorant, or willfully blind even. But the advantage to that is you can rectify the error, and then as you move forward, you're stronger. One of the things I taught my kids, and I hope at least somewhat successfully, was that you should always ask a stupid question. And that doesn't mean the sort of question that someone who wasn't paying attention would ask. If you're listening to someone and you don't understand what they're saying, and you reveal that, you're revealing your ignorance. And maybe you're in a room full of people and you think you're the only person stupid enough to not get it, which is very rarely the case, by the way. If you reveal that ignorance to yourself and to the other person, they can rectify it. And if you do that 1,000 times, you're not ignorant anymore.